Welcome to Shark Felt, where I felt that. Today we're needle felting Cinnamoroll from Sanrio. To start, I tightly roll up my base wool and begin poking at the rolled part with my largest felting needle and begin making the shape of his head. As I set off rolling up the wool once again, I make sure I'm keeping it in the shape of a rough oval, and once it is, I can start poking at it again with the same needle as before. At this point, I switch over to my two-pronged felting tool just to speed the process up. I want the head to be bigger than it is as of now, so I roll up the head into some more base wool and take the same steps as before to make it larger. Now it's just a repetitive process of rolling up the wool and poking at it until it's the correct size, which sounds boring, but honestly, it's pretty therapeutic. Had Cinnamoroll been a larger character, this would take longer, but luckily for me, he's super short. I'm talking literally 21.5 centimeters tall. But honestly, go off, Short King. Once the head is big enough and firm enough to work with, we can get to crafting the body. Grabbing another large tuft of my base wool, I roll it up tight and begin felting the body shape with my two-pronged felting tool. Gradually switching between my biggest felting tool, which has a ton of felting needles in it, and my two-pronged tool to help speed things along. Now I just continue to felt the body, making sure it's proportional to the head as I go. With the body's base complete, we can go about crafting him some little feetsies. I start out by getting my white wool out of its packaging, then begin tearing a tuft of it apart to make smaller versions of it to use for creating the feet. Rolling a tiny tuft of white wool between my fingers, I place it on the felting mat and get to poking at it with my large felting needle. Eventually switching over to my finest felting needle until I'm left with two egg-shaped pieces of wool to use as his feet. Now that the feet are finished, using a tuft of the same wool as before, I set about coloring the body. I accomplish this by gently poking at the body's base with my two-pronged felting tool until an entire half is colored in bright white. Then I repeat this step onto the other half and bottom until there's no more cream-colored wool peeking out through the white-colored one. With the body now colored, we can move on to coloring the head. Taking the same steps I did on the body, I felt in the white wool to color the head. Continuing to felt in the color all around the head's base until it's completely engulfed in white to completion. With his head done, we can attach some legs to his little egg feet. To do this, I just take a tiny tuft of white wool and felt it directly to the flat part on top of his foot. This is because I think it would be easier to do it this way since this part is extremely tiny. Here you see me adding more white wool on top of where the foot and leg connect. This is because I want to be sure that they're really attached to each other and won't fall apart later. That would be so tragic. Poor Cinnamoroll. With the legs complete, I push 4 normal needles through the legs into the body to hold them in place so that I can begin attaching them to his body. Now that that's done, I add a tuft of white wool where the legs meet the body on each side to smooth out the connection. This makes the legs look like one coherent part of the body instead of looking sewn on like some sort of Frankenstein. Legs attached, I pull out one of my felting stencils depicting flower petals, then put some white wool into one of the petals to start felting Cinnamoroll, a pair of arms. Once the wool is firm enough, I can remove it from the stencil and start shaping it to be more 3D instead of flat, free-handedly. With both arms completed, we can begin crafting his long, fluffy ears. Swear he could fly away with them things, though. I set off doing this by grabbing a ripped up medium tuft of my base wool and poke at it with a large felting needle to begin giving them shape. Once they've taken form, we can craft his most important feature, his cinnamon bun shaped tail of course. To start, I get out one of my felting stencils with circles on it, then place some base wool into the second largest circle and set about poking at it with a large felting needle. Eventually switching to my felting tool with many needles and removing it from the stencil. Then, I poke a spiral line into the circle to shape his curly tail, and cut along the line with my tiny wool shears to further emphasize the tail's shape. Carefully pulling apart the cut, I place the tail back down onto the felting mat and poke around the cut with a medium-sized felting needle to smooth out its form. Focusing back on the ears, I decide now it's time to add color to them. To accomplish this, I take out a tuft of white wool yet again and gently poke the ear's surface to cover up all of the base wool. Since y'all already know the coloring drill, I figured now is the best time to tell y'all Cinnamoroll is evil. Off camera, this little guy was hell. He broke 2 of my felting needles and I stabbed myself in the finger deep enough to draw blood 3 times. Which is crazy to me, because I haven't stabbed myself deep enough to draw blood ever since I started out needle felting 3 years ago. Anyways, once we finish up adding the white wool color to the tail, we can attach his ears to his head. Pushing in a few normal needles through his ears into his head as supports, I poke in a large felting needle through the 2 parts to join the pieces together as one. Carrying on felting, I make sure that I'm keeping the ears symmetrical up at the top as much as I can. I noticed as soon as I was done attaching the ears that some of the white wool got pushed into the cream wool as a result, so now I'll just go back in with my 2-pronged felting tool and re-add that white color to the tops of the ears that got lost in the process. There we go, that looks much better. Getting out my baby blue wool, I take a thin strand of it, place it on top of Cinnamoroll's tail, and start poking it in with my finest felting needle on each side to further emphasize the tail's curled shape, and also just because I think adding a splash of color to the tail would look cute ASF in 3D, of course. Then I snip off the remaining end of the blue strand and clean up the line with my small felting needle to make it extra pretty. Taking my baby pink wool out of its packaging, we can begin giving Cinnamoroll his signature rosy pink cheeks. With my normal needles already placed into his face, I use them as a guide to put a tiny tuft of pink wool onto the corners of each of his cheeks and poke in the color with a medium-sized felting needle. Cheeks complete, I begin to add his eyes by putting a small tuft of baby blue wool down onto his face and poking it in with a medium-sized felting needle, eventually switching over to a small-sized felting needle to clean up around the edges. Now that his eyes are finished, I place a baby blue strand of wool down right underneath my guide and begin poking in his tiny cat mouth with a small felting needle. Even though he's a dog, that's what we're gonna call it. Snipping off the ends of the blue strands found on his mouth, I go back in with a small felting needle and clean up the corners of his mouth so that they're smooth with no fluff sticking out. I poke the corners back in gently, ensuring I don't accidentally change the dimensions of his mouth. So cute. Now I place a tuft of white wool on top of his body where his neck would be and poke it into only the center of the neck. I prepare it this way because I need some fluff sticking out of the neck so that I can use it to attach the body to the head. I do so with my 2-pronged felting tool by poking the fluff which is stuck out into the head to connect the pieces. Seems sturdy. What happened before with the tops of the ears also happened to the neck, which is to be expected, so I just cover it up with more white wool to hide the base wool's color, just like in the past. Easy enough. Pushing normal needles into the tail through the body, I start poking my largest felting needle into the tail to join the 2 parts together. Similar to what occurred with the ears and neck, needle felting the base of the tail into the body completely flattened it, so I just bulk it back up with more white wool and smooth out the connection between the 2 parts. Once smooth, I push my support needles through the arms into the body and begin joining Cinnamoroll's arms to his body, which saying out loud sounds awful, like he was in a horrible accident or something. Once he's entirely assembled from head to tail, we can move on to the final step. Removing my small wool shears from their sheath like a knight with her sword, I slay all the stray hairs to give the piece a more finished look.
Slay! Slay!
Nah, just kidding. I wish it was that cool, but I'm really just removing all the icky nasties from him. And with that, he's done!